Until now, we have discussed the many causes of human violence and learned that there are multiple layers: biological, psychological, social, structural, environmental, and even nuclear. But to understand truly the extent and expanse of violence, we have to look at its consequences, which stretch far beyond bruises or broken bones, but ripple through minds, families, communities, and societies, across generations and throughout the globe. Violence is never just one moment in time. It is a mindset that unfolds in many aftershocks that translate into greater entrenchment in that mindset. The ever greater aftershocks we produce give the impression that violence is inevitable, when in truth our perception shapes everything from how we trust others to how we interpret situations, how we respond, and how societies reproduce cycles of harm. In other words, violence is not merely destructive, it is transformative, often in the worst ways possible. Its consequences help explain how violent environments produce further violence, and why breaking these cycles requires looking far deeper than the behavior itself. One of the most important consequences of violence is the emotional aftermath of being harmed, what we might call the internal world, shaped by humiliation, shame, and rage. These internal wounds are easy to overlook because they are not visible like physical injuries, and yet recent research shows that they may be even more consequential as they are more enduring. When someone feels helpless, humiliated, and devalued, especially by an authority figure such as a parent, partner, or boss, the psychological injury can take on a life of its own. American psychiatrist James Gilligan famously showed that shame is one of the most powerful predictors of later violent behavior. People who are repeatedly belittled or degraded often begin to see themselves as worthless, and that belief becomes a foundation for low self-esteem, self-harm, and, in some cases, violence against the world in retaliation or in a last resort attempt to salvage one's sense of self. Austrian-American psychoanalyst Heinz Kohut and other self-psychology theorists have demonstrated that early emotional injuries undermine the development of a coherent identity, and this is why many survivors experience psychological fragmentation, instability, and profound vulnerability. When children grow up in violent households, for example, they learn to anticipate threat everywhere, even in safe situations. That hypervigilance is adaptive in the moment. It helps you survive. But over time, it becomes a prison, shaping personality in ways that constrain relationships, limit opportunities, and perpetuate self-fulfilling expectations of harm. Violence also distorts how people see the world around them and how they interpret other people's intentions. One of the most striking ideas to have been proposed is perhaps what American social psychologist Roy Baumeister called the myth of pure evil, which is a belief that fictional and mythical so-called bad guys were born bad, and they do bad things because they like doing them. Human behavior is obviously more complex. The symptom that is most associated with violence, in fact, is paranoia. Not actual violence, but the exaggeration or invention of threat where none existed. Therefore, one can expect that for offenders of the greatest violence, they will have the greatest perception of the world as a menacing place. And the more fictitious the fear, the firmer the conviction of it as fact. In communities or nations recovering from mass violence, this way of thinking can block reconciliation for generations. They may even become blind to the violence they themselves inflict, believing it to be self-defense. Once people view entire groups as inherently dangerous, the door opens to discrimination, retaliation, and even genocide. Dehumanization is a relational consequence of violence. Victims sometimes dehumanize perpetrators to cope, and perpetrators often dehumanize victims to justify their actions. Social and structural violence seeps into families. Violence in one generation tends to reappear in the next, not because violence is doomed to repeat, but because violence changes how people form attachments, regulate their emotions, and discipline their children. Family violence then translates into intergenerational trauma, where parents who grew up in violent households epigenetically and psychosocially transmit emotional instability to their children. Anger outbursts, emotional detachment, inconsistency in caregiving, or generalized anxiety further shape a child's developing nervous system. The great American physician, Vincent Felitti, led a team of researchers to study what he called adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. He showed that childhood exposure to violence predicts everything from depression and addiction to chronic illness, heart disease, and early mortality, often by decades. The body keeps a score, as Dutch-American psychiatrist Bessel van der Kolk famously put it, revealing that trauma embeds itself not just in the mind, but in biological pathways such as inflammation, cortisol regulation, and neural connectivity. There's a profound physical dimension to violence beyond the surface injuries. Traumatic experiences reshape the neurobiology of stress. Survivors often experience long-term changes in brain structures responsible for emotion, memory, and threat detection. These changes make it harder to sleep, concentrate, regulate emotions, or feel safe in close relationships. For some, the body becomes stuck in fight or flight mode. For others, the stress system becomes numb, producing dissociation, emotional blunting, or chronic exhaustion. These physiological consequences partly explain why trauma survivors are at elevated risk for autoimmune disorders, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and premature mortality. Individual violence also ripples out into communities. People who experience violence often withdraw socially, mistrust institutions, and have difficulty maintaining stable relationships. When entire neighborhoods or communities live with pervasive violence, whether from street crime, oppressive policing, or mass incarceration, social cohesion deteriorates and collective efficacy erodes. Fear becomes a dominant emotional climate. As a result, residents may be less willing to intervene to stop conflicts, less involved in community activities, and less able to rely on one another for collective safety. Sociologists have shown that this breakdown increases the likelihood of further violence, creating a feedback loop. Fear breeds isolation, which breeds more violence, which deepens fear. Violence, in other words, has far-reaching community and society-level effects that exceed the level of the individuals who were pushed into committing the violent acts in the first place. Perhaps one of the most crucial consequences of violence is what it does to our way of thinking. Not just what we think, but the very process of our thinking. Chronic exposure to violence leads to changes in attention, memory, and problem solving. Some survivors are so consumed by intrusive memories or anxiety that their daily function is impaired. Others develop cognitive strategies that favor short-term survival over long-term planning. Still others identify with the aggressor to the point where They augment and facilitate the very violence that they deplored. Violence narrows mental bandwidth. A person who is constantly scanning for danger has less capacity for creativity, curiosity, or reflective thinking. This affects not only individuals, but entire societies. Populations traumatized by conflict or institutional oppression often struggle to maintain the civic trust and imaginative capacity required for democracy, education, and economic development, which further entrenches them in tendencies for autocracy and repression. Finally, violence has moral and existential consequences. It challenges people's basic beliefs about fairness, trust, and the meaning of suffering. Survivors often struggle with questions like, why me? Or how can the world contain such cruelty? As violence shatters assumptions about justice or safety, people lose their sense of self, as well as belief in the world, feeling spiritually disoriented or betrayed by faith traditions they once relied on. In some cases, survivors may develop a stronger sense of moral clarity or a desire to help others, what we call post-traumatic growth. In many others, however, they struggle with bitterness, hopelessness, or a sense that life has lost its coherence. What emerges across all these perspectives is a simple truth. Violence multiplies. It never ends as a single act. It creates emotional, physical, and spiritual consequences that shape the trajectory of individuals and societies long after the original injury. To address violence effectively, we must recognize the depth of these consequences, not just treating physical injuries, but healing emotional wounds, restoring relationships, strengthening communities, and breaking intergenerational cycles. Violence is powerful, but so is its repair. Once we understand the dynamics, we can also cause the cures to multiply. Understanding the full consequences of violence is therefore a crucial step toward positive transformation.